the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, episode 75.
Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to another edition of the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Ray, and today we bring back on Dr. David Grantham. If you missed his last appearance, we will link to it in the show notes, but a quick refresher. Dr. Grantham got a Bachelor of Art in History from the University of South Florida. He has a Master of Science in International Relations from Troy, and he has a Ph.D. in Modern History from Texas Christian University. We will link to all of his websites and Facebook, Twitter in the show notes, so be sure to check that out. And just a reminder, he is a leading expert in national security matters and international affairs with specializations in Latin America and the Middle East, which is why we brought him on to talk about just those things. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. David Grantham. Well, Dr. Grantham, since the last time we talked about Texas energy, a lot has changed around the world, especially in Venezuela, but we're glad to have you on to talk to us about today. How are you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me.
And for the listener's point of view, we are recording this on July 31st, and last night there was a lot of news about Venezuela and what's going on down there. Kind of take us, 30,000 foot, what's going on down there, and what should we be focusing on?
Yeah, the Venezuela problem has become a, I don't want to say it wasn't a disaster to begin with, but it's been like a slow-moving disaster, and the latest development has come in the last few days, where the President Maduro has essentially what he's attempting to do is create yet another sham election, as Nikki Haley called it, and I think rightfully so, where he's trying to further his power, further his agenda by creating this constitutional assembly or a government entity that will supposedly vote objectively on new measures that will give him and his party more power. And these votes, these elections, these bodies that he keeps convening are really just his cohorts, and it's assured that the votes will be in his favor. So as like I said, as Nikki Haley called it, it's really just sham elections. So that's really the first, most recent event.
Yeah, and so as someone sitting up here in America looking down, I know President Trump has come out and said that they are not going to acknowledge the results of the election and maybe issue some sanctions on Venezuela as well. But what does that mean, for just kind of a geopolitical picture? Other nations around the world, what is their take on what's happening in Venezuela? Obviously, just because the U.S. thinks something does not mean that's what the rest of the world thinks.
Right. The Venezuelan problem is there's several different avenues you can look at to determine why this matters for U.S. security, for international security. And I argue it's one of the more important issues in the world at the moment. For one, the region is becoming increasingly unstable. Mexico, if you look from Mexico south, so through Central America and into the northern tier of South America, where Venezuela is at, there's a tremendous instability in those areas. So if you look at Central America, for example, we are deporting, and by say we, the U.S. and the Trump administration is deporting a lot of gang members back to El Salvador. El Salvador is already faced with crippling economic conditions. So sending these guys back it's gonna cause problems. South of that, you have Venezuela now, where you have people leaving Venezuela, going into neighboring Colombia, and Colombian officials have already said we can't sustain what they anticipate to be more refugees coming over. And then you look north of Mexico, and Mexico this year has had an increase in murder rates, especially among journalists, which is a really frightening uptick in violence there. So when you look at that, you're seeing an increasing instability right south of our border. So that one should be a major concern for U.S. Officials and for Americans at large.
Right, and now if we step back and we say, okay, some of the reports have been, you talk about people leaving Venezuela. I've seen is that people are stockpiling food there, and they're prepared for the worst. And it sounds like what you're saying is that you're already seeing some of the effects of that. And if you step back, you just talk about security. One of the things that, especially here in the U.S., when you look at like pipeline security, is if you have people that are crossing the border illegally, especially, they will use pipeline right-of-ways or electrical line right-of-ways as modes of transportation because they're maintained, they're easy to travel, less things in your way, which means that you're endangering your grid just because you have people who are trying to navigate illegally across your borders.
Yeah, you bring up a good point that very few people are talking about is the interconnectivity of our infrastructure in the Western Hemisphere. If you recall the blackout several years ago that took out New York City for a few days, that actually reached into Canada and caused problems in Canada, and few people realized that, and obviously the news was more focused on New York City because that's a hub of international commerce and whatnot. But we have an incredible system that's becoming increasingly interconnected. So these pipelines, energy distribution networks, financial networks, roads, international trade, ports. I mean, you name it, and we're in a world where something like the Ebola crisis in Africa somehow hopped across the Atlantic and ended up in Dallas-Fort Worth. So you really have to take a look at how these things are panning out elsewhere and see where those connectivities, merge with the United States interests. So I think you bring up a really good point.
You bring up a good point there about the interconnectivity, and kind of where I was going is, some of the reports from Mexico, obviously you have the crime issue, but you also have that their economy seems that it may be getting some legs underneath it, especially, that's large in part, I would say, due to the reforms in the energy sector. And so you're seeing U.S. companies that are looking to invest dollars, entrepreneurs, big companies as well, that are looking to go down there, they're building pipelines across the border. And so when you see a company like Venezuela, who is a large they can be at least a powerful player in the energy community. Basically, I don't want to be too much hyperbole here, but they're falling apart at the seams. And you see Mexico, who's maybe trying to get their legs. You're shifting populations. It looks like that this could actually be a drag on the Mexican economy, which might actually have a chance to turn the corner with some of their energy reform.
Yeah, I would agree with some of that, and I would point out too that. Where Mexico and Venezuela, their economies, and I say this just as someone who's not an economist per se, but someone who's just studied the history of the region, that Venezuela, their economy is and was oil. And any fluctuation in the market could send them in a downward spiral. Iran is in a similar situation. So they have to depend on that export, where Mexico has the ability to be more diverse. So their energy sector could very well fuel other operations, but the criminal activity and the increase, it seems, in parts of Mexico with the violence could hamper those other industries that could support the energy sector and keep Mexico from becoming a Venezuela, where they're depending on one major export to fuel their entire economy. I just read an article a few days ago about another shipment of Ford cars from the Ford factories there in Mexico that were stuffed with drugs. There's a problem there, and I'm not sure how they're going to go about fixing that.
Well, one thing that you talk about Venezuela and their exports being oil is a main driver of their economy. One thing that gets lost in these discussions is when you look at Venezuela, and I don't care what side of the political aisle you come on. If you come in, you say, well, the U.S. is going to levy sanctions against Venezuela, may not buy as much oil or any of their oil. That's going to hurt the new leadership, whether you think they're doing the right, wrong, or it doesn't really matter. And I think one of the things, as far as energy professionals, we kind of lose is that means that people in Venezuela could go hungry, and so it's just sad to see that a government could make decisions like they're doing, hold fake elections. sanctions, and then ultimately the people who really have nothing to do with this are going to pay the price, and then they're going to have to be forced to leave because now they're hungry, they need a job, they need to support their family, they're trying to do the right thing, and so they go to Colombia or Mexico or try to come to the U.S., and all of a sudden you see, we talk about trickle-down economics, well, this is a trickle-down as well, because people who are being hostile to their own people and are hurting their own economy ultimately hurt the economies of other places because those people are now forced to leave just to provide basic necessities.
Yeah, that's the age-old debate on sanctions, is whether taking money away from a country is worth the consequences for the population, who, as you mentioned, is by and large innocent of the atrocities or the activities of their government in many cases. However, the idea that sanctions somehow take money and food away from these people kind of misses the overall point that with the government in power, those people have, in most cases, had food and money taken away anyway. If you look at the history of Iraq and Saddam Hussein, there was a creative measure intended to circumvent that consequence with oil for food. And what ended up happening was just yet another duplicitous operation by Saddam Hussein and his henchmen, to where the people were still not receiving the benefits of this oil for food. They still weren't receiving the food, any kind of funding that came along with that. So it is a tough position to take, and I'm reading today that the U.S. will, in fact, hit Venezuela with more sanctions, and which is unfortunate for the people. But at the same time, there's a lot of Venezuelans in the United States that would probably say, you know what, that needs to happen, because whether U.S. money flows in or not, Maduro is not going to redistribute that to the people.
Yeah, and I kind of got mixed views on the sanctions. It just kind of depends on the time and place, because like you point out with the oil for food program, you go in there, you try to do the right thing, and then the dictator still doesn't do it. And so it's a complex, nuanced debate. I just always like to bring it back to, we got to make sure as energy professionals or anyone that we can get into the U.S. versus Venezuela or this versus that, and we almost forget that there's people that are involved, and energy touches people on all levels. And so that's just some of the things that we got to keep in. We want to have nuanced views, like you point out. You go, okay, well, there's some pros here and there's some pros there, but let's transition a little bit to the Middle East, an area where sanctions from the U.S. standpoint are definitely common. There's a lot going on there. Kind of give us, what's your take on what's been happening in the Middle East? You have Iran and you have the Saudis, and it seems like these interests are trying to align, but at least from my standpoint, it feels like they're struggling to figure out where they want to go down the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, the Middle East region is it is a complicated animal, especially since the recent separation or the diplomatic fallout from Saudi Arabia and Qatar, which was essentially, and this is more simplistic, but for the sake of time, essentially was Saudi Arabia responding to Qatar's activity and their funding of groups like ISIS. And that came on the heels of the Trump administration, of the President Trump's visit to the region and to Saudi Arabia. And so that is one major development there that could very well affect how energy, the price of energy, the deals or the deliberations at OPEC. But the more recent event that seems to have brought Saudi Arabia back to its roots has been this debate over the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and where, for your listeners, where 2 Israeli police officers were shot and killed, and Israel responded by putting up metal detectors for those coming in and out of the Temple Mount. And the Palestinians took exception to this, Palestinian authorities and other pro-Palestinian countries in the region there. And Saudi Arabia has responded saying that what they're calling the internationalization of the Temple Mount is a violation of international law. And then there's a bunch of debates that go on with that. But the point is, Saudi Arabia went from cutting off Qatar because of their alleged terrorist connections to swinging back again to speaking very boldly and aggressively toward Israel. So the Trump administration has said we will stand with Israel, and they have also just signed a very big military deal with Saudi Arabia. All these things are going to complicate how we address that region, and it's going to complicate how the oil markets respond to it all.
Yeah, and I guess for me, that when you look at the Middle East, it seems like we almost are our own worst enemy there. It seems like we try to work out a deal with this group and that group, and as you mentioned, all these nations, and inside the nations, there are different tribal groups that have different beliefs, and as far as how they view it, what should be going on, and how much they get along. It just seems like sometimes our involvement there. Now we can debate on how involved we should be, but our involvement there, because we have our hands in so many different pies, it seems like we almost work against ourselves.
Yeah, that's been there's a long history of U.S. activity in the Middle East that it's hard to reconcile some of it. It's hard to understand the reasoning behind some of it, and a lot of it has to do with the traditional. I'll say a lot, but there's several instances where traditional diplomacy, wherein I define that as solutions that are not necessarily good or bad. They're just what needed to happen at the time. Like, when we saddled up next to Stalin in World War II, not because we probably wanted to or knew that it would be helpful going forward, but it was the right thing at that right time. And the Middle East becomes a lot of those stories where you say, we made this decision at this moment because it was the best thing at this moment, and it wasn't necessarily going to be, fruitful going forward. Now, I will say that the one constant in this is Israel. And Israel is a very pro-American, free market, stable country, politically, economically. The Palestinians depend on Israel to be economically strong, which is why this divest movement is so wrong-headed in that it's attempting to take down an Israeli economy that the people they supposedly are trying to help, it would hurt them. So Israel is a constant, and I think when you break everything down in the region, you break down all the U.S. policy, that's the one that regardless of where we stand, that's always going to be a problem with others in the region. And it's one that we should stick with. One, we should stand by Israel because of their government, because of their economy, because of who they are. But we've got to recognize that oftentimes that's what it's going to come back to, and that's a principle that I think we should fight for. That's a principle we should stand on.
Okay, so final thing for you. You brought up the Saudis and what's going on with Israel. I think some people thought that maybe President Trump was going to kind of push back Saudi relationships before he got into office, and it doesn't seem that that's going to be the case. Do you think he's handling the Saudis in the right way, or are you a little disappointed with his policy in regard to the Saudis?
Well, I'm holding judgment until I feel a bit more. I wasn't terribly pleased with how friendly he approached or how open he was with them when he traveled overseas. But then the relationship, Saudi made a very big move with the relationship with Qatar. And then President Trump decided to delay the U.S. Embassy's move to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv for 6 months. I wasn't terribly pleased with that decision, and I wasn't terribly pleased with how cordial it was, at least in appearances. I thought he should be a little bit more stern publicly with Saudi Arabia. But it looks like the benefit, whatever was talked about behind closed doors, resulted in Saudi Arabia taking a hard stance against Qatar. And one thing that your listeners should consider with Saudi Arabia is, regardless of how they act, they are opposed. They are, for all intents and purposes, an enemy of Iran. Iran and Saudi Arabia do not like each other. So again, it's one of those, my enemy's enemy is my friend, I guess you could say. Not to call Saudi Arabia an enemy, but the point being, they are a bulwark in the region against Iran. So you pick your poison with that one.
Right. Yeah, you're saying, okay, if you're looking at it, you're almost saying Iran, it might be the lesser of two evils, or some kind of analogy like that, where you say, okay, well, we got to side with someone, and we don't want to side with Iran, so we can pick the Saudis. I know I said last question, but I just thought about this. I was going to ask you about it. I saw a report maybe about 2 or 3 weeks ago that said that ISIS is actually falling apart because of the low oil prices, that they can't make money. And so, the whole Qatar thing and what's going on there with them funding them, it seems that ISIS may actually fall apart just because of low oil prices. Have you heard any of that, and what are your thoughts on that?
I've heard bits and pieces of that, and those are, it's interesting. The theory is interesting, but it's so difficult to determine that, short of having sources on the ground that can report back to you about specific financial developments within ISIS and their profit making. It's really hard to determine how legitimate a claim that is, but it makes sense on face value. It makes sense,
right?
Because ISIS makes a lot of money. Almost, I would say, a majority of their funds come from, or at least came from, oil. They controlled many oil fields. So if the price of oil is going down, and if Turkey and Syria, and Bashar al-Assad, who were their primary purchasers, if they can't get the price that they need, they're really a one-hit wonder when it comes to their profitability, and it's all based on oil.
Right, those were kind of my thoughts as well. As I was like, I can see why this would make sense, but I just don't have enough information to really cast a judgment on there. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I know you've kind of moved around since we last spoke to you, so why don't you let the listeners know where they can find you if they want to keep up between your appearances on our show?
Yeah, you can follow me on Facebook, David Grantham. You can also follow me on Twitter, David_Grantham, the number 1. You can also visit my website, drdavidgrantham.com.
Okay, and we will link to all of that in the show notes for the listeners. And you talk about a lot of stuff that's quite interesting. I'm here in Texas where we live. There was just a terrible case the other day of human trafficking and some folks that they found in the back of a 18-wheeler down in San Antonio. I know you were talking about that. So you talk about a lot of stuff, and a good follow on Facebook and Twitter and your website. So we will link to that in the show notes. Thank you so much for coming on, and we look forward to having you on again next month.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Enjoyed the conversation with Dr. Grantham today. And question of the day, Venezuela, what do you think will ultimately happen? Will the sanctions work and be able to slow down maybe what this government's doing? Or will the sanctions be something that, like they have been historically, maybe not that big of a deal? Love to hear your thoughts. Ryan at globalenergymedia.com. That's Ryan at globalenergymedia.com. The Global Energy Leaders podcast is produced by Michael Sims and Chris Prine. Chris Prine also serves as editor for the Global Energy Leaders podcast. Until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders podcast, powered by R Squared Global.